or the geometric mean. And that's because some people go way off in their judgments. If I give you this, it's 100, and I say, okay, here's this, and let's say the 100 was some dog food, and the sample I gave you was your favorite ice cream. You might give it 10,000. You start averaging 10,000 with hundreds, you know the mean is not too good a number. Medians are better, or the geometric mean. Now, one of the problems with aggregation, whether it's means or medians, or geometric means for that matter, is that it does tend to cover up the variability in the data which can be meaningful to you. For example, if we were to take a population at random and give them caviar to eat, and get an average for caviar, it might end up right in the center of the scale, of a 9-point scale. Then you say, okay, caviar is, people feel just neutral about it. And then you'd go on and report that. If you were to look at the data, you'd see that it was definitely bimodal. Some people, let's say on or the fact scale, say, I eat this every opportunity I had, whereas another group is saying, I'd only eat this if I were forced to. Now, is there a right answer? Well, obviously, if there's a right answer, it's the answer that says it's a product which is liked and disliked by different segments of the population. So to the extent to which you get bimodal or trimodal differences in how people like products, if you just use an overall aggregate value such as the mean, you may lose this kind of information. That's why it's very critical in any interval scale to look at the frequencies that you get for each of the points that you've measured, so that you get some idea of what the distribution is for the ratings. Now, that won't be the cause necessarily, but it'll give you a clue that perhaps this product is bimodally liked. And you have to go back and do some further examining, experimentation. What makes one group of people different than another? How do you reach them? Are the caviar lovers all on one side of the town, in one state? How do I get to them? Do I want to market a product like that? But certainly it can raise very relevant questions, and just reporting the fact that there's no significant difference between two means may be covering up a great deal of very important information. That's, by the way, why some people like to use ordinal type information, because you don't report it in means. You just say 60% of the people like this better than this. And you're just counting people then. And there's some advantages to this type of activity. Well, I mentioned some other characteristic of consumer tests very briefly, and that has to do with, if you will, the attribute evaluation within a consumer test. When people say they like or dislike something, or they would only eat it if we're forced to, or prefer one product to another, the question generally comes up as why do they like it, why do they dislike it? What can you do about this? Well, one thing you can do is just ask them to put down why. Put comments down. Why do you like it? Why don't you like it? And then you have to analyze these on a content basis. Or you could have people check off on a predetermined checklist, such as a simple 3-point one. It's too salty, saltiness about right, not salty enough. You can apply that to any characteristic that you think might be appropriate for that particular product. Or you can get very sophisticated and have the bipolar scales, the 7-point scales that, let's say, on the saltiness characteristic go from high in saltiness to low in saltiness, and a person checks off someplace on the scale. Now, all of these techniques are used and work to some extent, but they all have a critical problem in that most people will, in fact, rate things on a checklist based on how they like or dislike it, and you get tremendous biases. And there's a lot of evidence to indicate that once you've said you've liked the product, the chances are that you're going to endow it with all the positive characteristics you can think of and take away from it, all those things in a sense that you feel it shouldn't have. Now, it's not a simple problem. Some people give checklists first rather than give people a preference choice first. Ideally, I think it's important to develop a bridge between the instrumental measures in the laboratory, the descriptive measures, the discriminative ones, and even the affective ones there, and what you get from consumer-type testing, rather than depending on the consumer to tell you why. Generally speaking, the consumer is good for one thing, and that is telling you they like or don't like it, or a degree of it, or whether they'll buy it. When you start asking them why questions, you run into a terribly difficult area. Okay, lastly, I wanted to mention a bit about analyses. And again, the analysis depends on what the problem is and what kind of data you're collecting. It might be percentages. If it were a paired preference test, 70% prefer this, 30% prefer the other. It could be a mean or a median. You might be analyzing this by the t-test if it were 2 samples, or if it were more than 2 samples, you might be using the analysis of variance. You might be showing charts that show the distributions of ratings at several points. You might certainly be using correlation techniques. Obviously, the analyses can be quite broad. One other point I wanted to mention before I close has to do with validity. It's a concept that I think is quite critical, and I wanted to differentiate between 2 kinds of validity, internal and external. It's a very simple differentiation. Internal validity means that you're measuring what you think you're measuring about the samples and people that you're testing. Whereas external validity means that the results you find from your particular sample of products and people will generalize to other samples and other people. For example, I might be able to measure with very high internal validity exactly what this class likes in terms of a particular food product. And I have no question about the fact I know what you like, and that you'll go out and eat that thing that you said you like. But if I were to say that because you like it, some other class would like it, or people in the town would like it, then I'm working in the area of external validity. What evidence do I have that that's true? So you may do a very good job of measuring what people like in the sample that you have, but you may at the same time be doing a very poor job about measuring what people would like in some other area. So one has to sit down, and when they design the sampling of products and of people and the way they're tested, to consider factors of external validity. Because eventually, if the product gets to the market at all, it's going to have to suffer the consequences of being tested where external validity will become a very critical factor. That's it. Thank you.